when you say that all these systems of control are within the West Bank, for example, about different checkpoints, and even though you are describing the chaos, lack of organization, for me, for an outsider, the fact that there are so many systems that break down Palestinian society, the way the wall goes, the way the checkpoints are, seems to me strategically set up to break down movement, and I mean that itself is what I would call a master plan. The master plan is to, bluntly said, break down civilian society. Does that sound? I mean, that is a master plan, isn't it?
In 1948, there was a kind of master plan to try to control Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this master plan was based on recruiting collaborators, bribing them, while at the same time punishing those who express dissent. And in fact, Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military rule for almost 20 years, until the end of 1966. But even that system, because it was built on an idea of unwritten rules and professional camaraderie between the Israeli secret police members, it did break down in a way, and it stopped being an efficient system of repressing the population. And in 1967, the occupation of the Palestinian territories, Moshe Dayan, who was then Minister of Defense, did try to come up with a master plan. And his idea, which was also the idea of the first governor of the occupied territories, the military governor, Shlomo Gazit, was to create short-term economic prosperity for Palestinians in order to get Palestinians to have what they call something to lose, with the understanding that people who have something to lose are less likely to rebel. The idea was to try to convince Palestinian refugees from Gaza to move to the West Bank in order to get them to lose their refugee status and forget that they're originally from inside 48 borders. They had systems of recruiting municipalities and municipal workers as kind of collaborators in order to create a sense of continuity, that there is no void in government, and they also to keep the Israeli army away from the centers of the population in order to minimize friction with the local population. And if you think of this system, it is a very clever system. And Moshe Dayan, Shlomo Gazit, and the other officers were very aware of the mistakes made by imperial and colonial powers in the past. And they looked at what happened in Algeria, they looked at what happened in Vietnam, they looked at what happened in India, and they said, we are not going to do that same mistake, we're going to be more clever, and we're going to set up what they called enlightened occupation. This is really a very excellent plan that they had, in the sense that it was very, very smart, very sophisticated, but it didn't last. It didn't last because they had no way of enforcing the plan on the various different players. Because immediately when the projects to fund, there were a few projects to fund assistance to the Palestinian economy, especially in terms of agriculture and a little bit of job creation, which were intended to help create loyalty or at least content among the Palestinian population with the Israeli occupation. But the military, the civilian officials who were managing these funds didn't really understand and didn't feel that they should be spending money on Palestinians. So they cut the programs. And that's when the whole master plan started to fall apart. When the secret police started to play a kind of game where they would revoke the working permit from Palestinians who express political opinions, that also undermined the plan, because then a lot of Palestinians who were eloquent in their political opinions started to lose their ability to find work, and so they were no longer content. They became more dissatisfied and angry at the occupation, and in many different ways, the occupation became a heavy burden on the Palestinian population, even though the original plan was to try to avoid that. And that reached a moment of the first Intifada, 1987, in which the Palestinian population already felt that the occupation is unbearable. But because this enlightened occupation concept has fallen apart from the bottom and not from the top, the Israeli population was not aware of that. And the Israeli population thought that the occupation is good for Palestinians. They really believed that. And they believed that Israel created prosperity and brought civilization to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And when the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza started their intifada and demanded freedom and equality, the response in Israeli society was that these people are being ungrateful. It was a kind of very arrogant and patronizing approach. How can the Palestinians be angry? We've given them everything. That sort of thing. So the response of the Israeli population, which was of course reflected immediately in the Israeli army, to the Palestinian resistance, because they felt the Palestinians are ungrateful, was just vicious violence and merciless punishment, because they felt that they must punish this ingratitude, and used excessive power against Palestinians. And even though these Israeli soldiers often like to think of themselves as if the Israeli army is a moral army, an enlightened army, they had a lot of Ehud Barak actually still believes after the invasion of Gaza that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. Well, I don't think he really believes it, but he's willing to repeat that motto again and again. But you can see that the soldiers were responding with emotion and not with rationality, by the fact that, for example, that they invented a machine gun that throws stones. The Palestinian children that were throwing stones at them were not very effective fighters. They were not able to penetrate the armor platings on the Israeli military vehicles with their stones, but they did hurt the Israeli pride somewhat. So rather than address this in a political way, or rather than address it even in a military fashion, as the soldiers wanted to throw stones back at the children, and they invented this machine gun that throws stones. It's a very deadly a weapon, because it fires about 300 stones per minute, so it's not really comparable to the strength of a child's arm, but it is a symbol of the breakdown of the master plan. If you think about it, if you would be making planning a master plan to control a population, to break it apart, to disempower it, would you invent a machine gun that throws stones? This is really where you see the Israeli society becoming decadent and becoming self-destructive. So yes, still a lot of Israeli officers and politicians believe that the Palestinian population can be divided, can be disempowered, can be discouraged from resisting. But the policies of trying to do that make absolutely no sense. The siege on Gaza is not... I don't think there is even one a member of the Israeli cabinet who believes that if Israel prevents children in Gaza from having chocolate to eat by means of the siege, that will get the population of Gaza to overthrow Hamas. I don't think anybody believes that Palestinians are going to overthrow Hamas in the name of chocolate. But not a single Israeli member of cabinet is willing to stand up and say that very simple, obvious fact, because then immediately that minister would be called a coward and a traitor.
So what is the boycott on Gaza? It includes chocolate?
Well, now there is a slight easing, and actually the easing on that siege only happened after the Freedom Flotilla events and the massacre on the Mavi Marmara. Before that, Palestinians in Gaza were not allowed to have chocolate, but more importantly, they were not even allowed to have writing materials for schools. So pencils were also considered dangerous commodities. notebooks. After the Freedom Flotilla, then more products were allowed to enter into Gaza. There was more because of the international pressure. And again, this is a clear case of irrational policy, because now it is clear to everyone in the world that the only way to break the siege on Gaza is to put pressure on Israel, and anyone who and not what Israel was trying to claim, that the siege on Gaza is because Palestinians deserve it.
But some people are under the impression that the siege has been eased so much that it's okay now.
The main part of the siege that hasn't been eased at all is the export. The merchants in Gaza are perhaps allowed to import a few more things, mainly if they import Israeli products, that they are more likely to be allowed to import because that benefits some Israeli companies. But if they try to export from Gaza, this is almost impossible. There has been a few shipments of flowers and vegetables, but basically Gaza exports are frozen, which means that for the merchant in Gaza, maybe they are allowed to import products, but where are they going to get money to import it from if they're not allowed to export? And now Gaza remains the single area in the world that is the most aid-dependent area. The aid dependency levels in Gaza are more than anywhere else in the world, because indeed Palestinians don't have the ability to export and to produce. In the invasion of Gaza, we've heard about of 2008-2009. We heard about 1,400 people being killed. We heard about homes, about 4,000 homes have been destroyed. What not many people talk about is that 400 factories in Gaza were bombed in a very clear, intentional way to destroy the small but very important industrial sector in Gaza, and make hundreds, if thousands of people actually unemployed. So the siege is definitely not lifted. The siege is quite severe. A word also has to be said about the fishing rights, because Palestinian fishermen are not allowed to go into the sea deeper than about 2 kilometers. They've already fished the first 2 kilometers completely. It's almost impossible for them to find any more fish in that area. But if they try to go a little bit deeper into the sea, Israeli combat vessels attack them and shoot at them. So they're restricted from fishing. So yes, the siege is still extremely tight. But when I say Palestinians in Gaza are very dependent on aid, it's not because they want to, of course. And you can hear that there is a complete consensus in Palestinian society that they would rather not receive aid and instead would have jobs and produce their own livelihood, and they don't want to depend on anyone. The problem, of course, is that because they are dependent on aid, because Israel does not allow them to produce their own income and their own products, they also become, they get this stigma from the international community as if they are useless, as if they are unproductive, as if they are parasites, because they don't go to work, they just get aid all day. But that's, of course, the exact result of Israel's occupation.